Okay. Yay, we are recording. So yeah, thank you so much for taking some time to spend some time with us today. I am going to share my screen through the beginning of this process, and then once we get to the Q&A portion of this, I'm going to stop sharing so that I can better see everybody during our session. So let me go ahead and start this slideshow officially. Okay. Okay, is everybody able to see my screen properly? Does that look right? Yeah, we're good? Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're here today to talk about the COVID-19 response grants. And our agenda for today is pretty simple. I'm going to go over some background information about these grants and sort of where they come from. We're going to talk about the grant types, some eligible expenses, and by extension, some ineligible expenses, the process of applying for the grant. We're going to review some important dates and then save as much time as possible for Q&A. I want to be very, very clear that this is not going to be a comprehensive review of all of the relevant information from our guidelines. It is critically important that you read the guidelines because we definitely do not have time today to sort of go word by word through the whole section. We're going to hit the big stuff, okay? So just a little bit of background on the American Rescue Plan Act, the awkwardly named ARPA, as it is called. This is the big, the latest big COVID relief bill that you have probably read about since it passed in March. This was approved by the US Congress and signed into law by President Biden. It incorporates $1.9 trillion in funding. It's one of the largest rescue packages we've ever had in this country. As part of the American Rescue Plan Act, the National Endowment for the Humanities received $135 million in supplemental funding, and 40% of that funding was designated by Congress for the state humanities councils. There are 56 jurisdictional state and territory humanities councils, of which New Jersey is obviously the superior. We are here in New Jersey going to receive just under $1.2 million. And the vast majority of that funding is going toward re-grants to organizations that do humanities work. So almost all of that funding, some of it we're designating for some other programs, and of course for us to actually run these programs, but the vast majority of that funding, about $1 million, will be going out to other institutions who do humanities-based work here in New Jersey. So the most exciting part about this was that this funding, this supplemental funding that is separate from the regular funding we get from the National Endowment for the Humanities each year, has allowed us to reopen a grant program we created last year called our COVID-19 response grants. Some of you I know received funding and applied for funding on that program last spring. That funding came from the CARES Act, much better name, my personal opinion, but we have more funding this time, so that's nice. Much like last year, a big reason for this funding is relief, COVID relief. So what are the things that you need to do the work that has been so enormously impacted either directly by COVID restrictions or sort of indirectly through the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. But it's also really important to note that this year's grants, the COVID-19 response grants through the American Rescue Plan Act, have a broader focus than just relief efforts. They're also focused on recovery. So when you're thinking about what you want to apply for and what expenses would be eligible, it's not exclusively that emergency, I need it right now or else we're going to go under kind of funding. That is absolutely included. But more broadly, how can this funding help you plan for the future? Think about not only what we need right now, but what are we going to need continuously moving forward as we move away, to some degree, away from that immediate emergency need and into a longer recovery plan. So that's kind of a little bit of the background on the ARP fund. I should mention, I'm planning on going through this pretty quick, but we will definitely have lots of time to come back, ask questions, and reply. And James, along the way, if there are specific questions that I should address most, like immediately, please do let me know in case we hit anything. So, foundational to this grant program, to the COVID-19 response grant program, and of course, all of the work we do at the New Jersey Council for the Humanities are the public humanities. So I'm going to take a moment. I want to take a moment for us to talk about what we mean when we talk about the public humanities. So a shorthand that we frequently use is that the humanities explore our human histories, our values, cultures, and beliefs. And we can think about the humanities in terms of subjects of the humanities, and that includes everything from history and literature to philosophy, jurisprudence, rhetoric. I often describe us as the studies people, whatever studies, gender studies, area studies, etc. We're studies people. We like studying things. But it also incorporates what I think of as humanities practices. So not only, is it about history or is it about literature or whatever, but there's also these practices of the humanities, which include such things as critical thinking, inquiry, dialogue, and analysis. Those are foundational practices of the humanities most broadly. Embedded within this, you may have noticed that I said specifically the public humanities, and this is really critical to the work of the New Jersey Council for the Humanities in particular, and our state humanities councils generally speaking. We live very much in the realm of the public humanities. And when we talk about that, what we're talking about is broad access to humanities discourse, rather than the academic humanities where your access may be much more limited. So we're thinking very much about how can we get lots of people involved in all of that humanities, all those humanities subjects, and all of that type of humanities work. Additionally, we think about the public humanities as being publicly oriented, of having a social approach about putting work in context. The humanities, when you have anything that involves both like jurisprudence and also literature, obviously we're talking about a big umbrella, and there's definitely a lot of gray areas around the humanities. The ones that we see in particular coming sort of across our desk tend to be the arts and the social sciences. And there is indeed a lot of overlap between the arts and the social sciences and the humanities. But they are not exclusively, they do not 100% overlap, right? There's a Venn diagram, not an overlap between the two. There is a lot more detail about this on our website, both connecting to the National Endowment for the Humanities definition of the humanities, our definition, other resources for it. So there's a lot of detail about this on our website and in the guidelines. But broadly, when we think about the arts, we think about the creation and performance of art. The humanities component of the arts has a lot more to do with, again, that analysis part and interpretation of the arts. So one of the ways to think about this is like making a painting, arts. Art history, the humanities. Similarly, in the social sciences, the portions of the social sciences that relate to analysis and analytical ideas rather than numerical ideas tend to be the area that's like the sweet spot for us as well. In social services, it's important to understand that the humanities are of benefit to the to human people, of course, but this is very different than a humanitarian project. So while we see enormous value in programs that provide food, shelter, everything related to that, those are humanitarian concerns rather than humanities. And a lot of these same ideas can apply to other areas as well. For example, in the sciences, bench science, not supported by the humanities, however, history of science is. So if you have specific questions about that, about what the humanities and the public humanities in particular really focus on, this is a great thing for us to discuss in more detail in our Q&A session. COVID-19 response grants. First thing, if you have not done so, you probably have because you found your way to this session. But if you have not done so, njhumanities.org/grants/COVID-19, or if you just go to grants and then follow the prompts, has everything you need to know to apply for a COVID-19 response grant. As I said before, strongly recommend that you read everything on those websites. All of the, just to be very clear about this, everything that is on the website is the entirety of the guidelines for these grants. However, we do on that site also have PDFs of the full guidelines for each grant type, as well as links to applications. So if you'd like to if it's easier for you to look at it in a PDF rather than on web pages, by all means, take those PDFs, download them to your computer, print them out, whatever is convenient for you. But make sure to read through all of the guidance since we are not going to be exhaustive about it today. We have two types of COVID-19 response grants. There is General Operating Support, or GOS grants, and Program Support grants. These two types are important because you can only apply for one. So whichever type you qualify for, and we're going to get into that in a moment, that is the type of grant that you can apply for, and you can only apply for one. They have very different eligibility criteria for the two types of grants. So getting in more detail there, I'm going to start with our GOS grants, General Operating Support grants. These grants go from $5,000 to $20,000, and they are for organizations whose mission is based in the public humanities. To be eligible, in addition to having a humanities-based mission, you need to have a budget greater than or equal to $50,000 and at least one FTE. So mission in the public humanities should be pretty clear. If your mission includes some humanities work but is not primarily focused in the humanities, this is probably not the program for you, and you should probably apply for a program support grant. If your mission is solidly in the public humanities, this is the program for you. In terms of the budget, the $50,000 budget cap, there's actually two ways that we would potentially allow you to make this requirement. One is if your last budget or your current budget shows a minimum of $50,000 in spending. Great, fantastic. However, we also know that the last year and a half has had enormous impact on budgets. So there are some organizations that would be able to make that budget threshold prior to the pandemic, but can't do so now. For that purpose, what we've actually asked for is an average budget over the last 3 years. So if your average budget over the last 3 years pushes you over the $50,000 threshold, then you're still fine, even if your most recent budget perhaps doesn't. If you have specific questions, if you're not sure for your specific organization, this is a good thing to reach out to us about with to look at your specific situation, look at your documents and so on and so forth. An FTE is a full-time equivalent. And we specified FTE rather than saying one full-time employee, because if you have part-time employees who add up to at least one full-time employee, then that you would also qualify here. So for example, 2 part-time people who reach a full-time equivalent, fantastic. There are lots of calculators available. If you do a quick Google search on full-time equivalent, you can find a detailed explanation. You can find calculators to help you determine that. A full-time equivalent is 2,080 hours a year, which is calculated at 40 hours a week times 52 weeks a year, in case you're wondering where that comes from. Again, if you are not quite sure about this, it's a good question to ask for us. And again, if you had the 1 FTE prior to the pandemic and then dropped below it briefly and are working your way back up, you should apply for a GOS grant and include that information in your application. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the types. This is not the only part. The types of eligible institutions. This is not an exhaustive list, I should mention, of eligible institutions, but we'll give you an idea of the types of institutions that are eligible. Some examples: museums, historical societies, heritage organizations, other cultural and community nonprofits that have humanities-focused missions. So, however, this is also one area where we have more organizations that are, more types of organizations that are not eligible. And as you start to look at that list, the ineligible, so this is if your institution fits in one of these categories, you are not eligible for a GOS grant. That includes colleges and universities, other K through 12 educational institutions, government departments, organizations that don't have a humanities-focused mission, for-profit business, foreign entities, and individuals. The first four types of organizations that I'm talking about, this is general operating support funding. So the funding can be used for virtually anything that your institution does if you can receive a GOS grant. For that reason, organizations that have multiple parts, such as a college or university, such as a government, where a lot of the functions related to that institution will not be humanities related. I can tell you that, you know, your city council does a lot of stuff besides, you know, engage with the humanities, for sure. I hope so anyway. I really hope they're filling your potholes and whatnot. So that's sort of why we have that designation between those two different parts. However, almost all of the types of institutions that are not eligible for a general operating support grant will be eligible for a program support grant. So we're going to get to that in a moment. Most important thing to think about when you're thinking about which program to apply to, if you are eligible for a GOS grant, if you hit all the eligibility guidelines, apply for that program. It is the most flexible program. Everything that you can do with a program support grant, you can do with a general operating support grant and more. So that is absolutely the one that you should apply for if you are eligible for it. Okay. Like I said, if the other type of grant we have is a program support grant, and these grants are a little broader. They incorporate $2,000 to $20,000. So if you're a very small institution and might need a very small amount of money, this is the one to apply for. These are for organizations that are doing any type of public humanities work, even if humanities is not your primary mission. For example, if you are one of our aforementioned art organizations, right? A creative arts organization where your primary mission is the creation or performance of art, but you do have a humanities focused program within that. We know there are many of them in New Jersey because we support them through other grant programs. This is the program for you. And program support grants can be for new programs or existing programs, doesn't matter. And like I said, virtually any organization that does not qualify for GOS funding, as long as you are doing public humanities work, you will qualify for a program support grant. So, for example, if you are a humanities missioned organization, but you don't meet some of the eligibility criteria related to the GOS grants, for example, if your budget is below $50,000 or you don't have any paid staff, full-time staff, you don't have that one full-time equivalent, you can apply here for a program support grant. And basically, if you are humanities missioned nonprofit, essentially all of your work is going to qualify under that program heading. This might include museums, libraries, archives. Colleges and universities are eligible to apply in this program for humanities-based work that you do. So are K through 12 institutions. Historical societies and heritage organizations, that's a pretty easy one. Any department of government, local or statewide, or agency that does humanities-focused work. One of the biggies in this area is our public libraries. Public libraries don't do exclusively humanities-based work, but they do a lot of humanities-based work, and they can apply for funding to continue to do that work through this program. And then, as I've gone into some detail about already, if you're an organization that does not have a humanities mission, such as a science organization, an arts organization, a social service organization, but you do have a humanities-focused program, you can apply to program support grant to support your program within your institution. Okay. There are a few that are still not eligible. For-profit businesses never eligible for grants. Neither are foreign entities or individuals through this program. Okay, I'm going to breathe for a moment here. Use of funds. So we've written pretty detailed information about how you can use your funds, how you cannot use your funds, and how you should think about the amount of funding that you're going to apply to for each program type on our website. So this is going to go, the website goes into so much more detail. The guidance goes into so much more detail than I'm going to be able to go into here. But broadly, again, your grant award. So if you apply for and you receive a grant, will go from the date that you receive your award through December 31st, 2022. So you're looking at more than a year to be able to spend out the funds that you receive from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. The funds can apply to both operational and programmatic expenses. We're going to go into a little more detail about that in a moment. There are some specific ineligible costs associated with these grants, but honestly, not a lot of them. And they're pretty standard for federal grants. And then, like I said, there's much more detail in each grant type related to this. Something very important when you're thinking about applying for a grant is going to be right sizing your grants. Now, all of our grants are fairly small. You know, they're sort of, when you can put them all together, they're between $2,000 and $20,000. So $20,000 is our largest grant that we have possible. One nice thing about these grants, they require no match at all. And in fact, we can't, in general operating support grants, we can't even ask you for a match. On program support grants, if you wish to include matching funds, you may, but it's not required, not important at this moment. But right sizing your grants is going to be very important because we will definitely not be able to give you an extension on these grants. So if we reach the end of your grant period, December 31st, 2022, and you have not spent out your funding, you're going to have to give that funding back to us. And what is particularly sad about that is we will then have to give it back to the federal government. I don't like giving funding back to the federal government because they already don't support us enough in the humanities. So we don't want that to happen. So make sure that whatever you're asking for are funds that you can spend out over the next year. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about use of funds within GOS programs, specifically the general operating support costs. As the name indicates, these funds go to general operating support. That's what they're here for. And that includes your most basic operational expenditures, including staff salaries, whether that's your full-time staff, part-time staff, temporary staff, consultants, things like that. Administrative costs. Yes, you can pay your mortgage with this. Yes, you can pay your electrical bill with these funds. Programmatic expenses. So, if you run a program and your program involves, being outside and you need tents in order to make that happen because you don't want people to have rain on their heads, great. You can pay for your tents with this. You can pay for your pencils that you need, anything related to your program, to basic programmatic expenses, what we call supplies and services. But again, this is focused not only on your immediate needs now, but also as we think more broadly about recovery. So if there are needs you have for strategic planning, for capacity building, for learning, for retraining of staff, all of those expenditures can be included in your general operating support grants. Included technology in every way that you can possibly imagine it, whether it's specific costs that are related to technology, your Zoom license, for example, or expertise that you need to help you implement this technology. So if having somebody train your entire staff on how to more effectively use a Zoom, Zoom webinar format, great. You can pay for that consultant to do that work. A big part of this pandemic for all of us has been pivoting to new different activity types. A lot of that has meant a shift to virtual programming, but also moving your programs outdoors, setting up safe spaces inside. And we know, because we've all lived through this, that things can change very rapidly related to this. So helping have ways for your organization to incorporate flexibility, knowing that COVID is going to be around us for a while and may sort of ebb and flow at different times of the year, great. And then also related, and something that has both come up related to the pandemic and more broadly, equity assessments and equity planning, particularly as you think about access in your communities to the types of programs that you do. We have long, for many, many years now at the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, emphasized access to the humanities for underserved and underrepresented populations, and that remains a focus of this program, of this grant program, in addition to all of the work that we do at the council. Program support grants, slightly different, but a way to think about it might be to think about general operating support at a program level rather than at an organizational level. So again, rather than thinking about the whole work that your organization does, you want to think about the program specifically for which you're applying to. So within that program, what are your staff and operational costs associated with the humanities program? This can include a portion of your organizational operating expenses. So no, we can't pay for perhaps your whole electric bill, but if your humanities program, for example, consists of 5% of the work that your organization does over the course of a year, then we could pay for 5% of your electrical bill. That would make sense. This can include both your full-time staff, as I mentioned, but also contract or temporary labor, the costs associated with that, including any expenses for oh my goodness, what is it called? It's called when you have your benefits, in addition to the actual labor costs. Planning and development of new programs, reimagining existing programs, any expenses associated with keeping your programs running, whether they're new or they've been around for 25 years. And when you think about program expenses, again, think about your technology needs. Think about, what do you need if your programs are moving to different spaces or taking different formats, and any efforts you might have to increase access. And I should mention, since it's not explicitly mentioned in our guidelines, that things like marketing expenses, social media expenses can all be pulled in. These are all programmatic expenses, and for both general operating support and program support, those are totally reasonable expenses to include. There are some expenditures that are not allowed through these funds. Our list reflects exactly what the National Endowment for the Humanities mandates on this. I pulled out a few of the biggies. There's actually a much longer list that is in the guidelines, but I wanted to pull out a few of them specifically because they're the ones that we see most often that might come up in our in the grant applications we receive. So work outside of the humanities is the biggie, right? This is the National Endowment for the Humanities. We're the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. Humanities is our thing. So if the work is outside of the humanities, and there's a definition of this in this ineligible expenses category, that is not eligible for this funding. Overlapping costs with other federal grants. You are welcome to apply for as many other federal grants as you wish, and other programs as well, but your expenses cannot overlap. That would be considered double dipping, right? So if you're applying for, the cost of your program director from September to June, then you can't apply for that same funding from a different federal grant. This is particularly important because this applies to existing New Jersey Council for the Humanities grants. So if you have an open incubation or action grant, you want to look particularly closely at this, and we will be following up with you to just verify that all of your information is correct. Similarly, for anyone who has an open NJCH incubation or action grant, This funding cannot be used to satisfy your required match. So no connection between these two funds. They have to be kept entirely separate. Collections, acquisitions, whether that's archival materials, material culture, anything related to that acquisition, not eligible with this program. You can't take these funds and give them out again through a competitive re-grant, through a prize, an award, or a scholarship. None of this funding is eligible to be used in that way. Travel expenses are not allowed at all. I was actually a little surprised by this one. Purchase of land, construction projects, renovation, purchase of a new building, definite no. And this last category I wanted to mention, but it's a little complicated, lobbying, legislative support, and advocacy of political action. There's more detail about all of these things on the website, but it's very important that that any of this work that your organization does cannot be paid for with federal funds. Lobbying and support of specific legislation are the particular areas that we want to be very careful of, as well as if there is a specific political action. And this would include something like, we want you to sign this petition to change this law. None of that can be paid for. You are welcome to do that work, you just can't pay for it with our funds. So a sort of simple way of thinking about this, we don't want to suggest that advocacy for your type of work is completely off the table. That's not the case. A simple way of thinking about this perhaps for you would be to say, a way that you can advocate for your organization is to say, we are great, history is great, literature is great, but you cannot say, we are great, therefore please email your congressperson to increase our funding related to this. We are great, therefore we want to change this, local legislative agenda to include us, etc. If you find that this work applies to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us to talk in more detail about where those lines are drawn, because it is a little gray and a little weird. I agree. Okay. Application process. We have an application system called Foundant that will incorporate the entire process from you, from the moment you begin your application all the way through to the administration of your grant, reporting on your grant, all the way to the end. And the link to that application system is available on the website. So when you start your application, your first step is going to be to set up an account. If you already have an account in the system, you can just go ahead and log in. Once your account is set up, it'll include, setting up, and it'll be associated with your email address. You'll set a password. You'll input some basic organizational information, and then that will eventually bring you to a page where you can apply for stuff from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. And you will see COVID-19 response grants, GOS, and COVID-19 response grant program support there. Choose the one that applies to you and you'll begin. The first step of the application process will be to submit an LOI. That stands for a letter of intent. The letter of intent at this stage for us is an eligibility check. So we're asking you for very basic information. We will verify that you are indeed eligible for the type of grant that you are applying for. It'll include a very short explanation of what you want to use this funding for. I mean, literally a couple of sentences, totally fine. And then once we have verified your eligibility, assuming you are indeed eligible, we will open up your application. You will receive a notice that says, congratulations, start your application, and you will see the full application in your dashboard when you log into the system. When you're done writing your application, you submit it to us. We're going to get it into deadlines in a moment, but it'll be reviewed at the next available deadline, and you'll receive notification of whether or not you've received an award about 2 to 3 weeks after each deadline. I want to mention that while we anticipate a lot of applications to this program, we have a lot of funding to give. So these are not likely to be super competitive grants. We hope they won't be. They are not intended to do. We need to spend down this money. Like I said, any money that we don't spend, we have to give back to the federal government. And I don't like to do that. I want to give it to you. So please do consider applying and let us know if we can help you figure out the best ways to do that. We have 3 deadlines. They are July 15th, September 1st, and October 15th. So it's basically every 6 weeks throughout the summer and then into the fall. You can start your application at any time. And then when you submit it to us, we will review it at the next available application deadline. So if you submit on July 10th, we'll review it on July 15th. If you submit on July 20th, it will be reviewed on September 1st. That's the next available deadline, and so on and so forth. I should mention that there is funding reserved for each round. These are not rolling deadlines, so you don't have to apply early in order to verify that there will still be funding available for you. If it turns out you do not receive funding on a given round, you can reapply. All you'll have to do is email, there'll be instructions related to this, but you'll just send us a message saying, please reopen my application. You can make updates, you can change information, and then resubmit your grants. Whether or not you choose to resubmit on a specific deadline, any organization that has applied to us and has not received funding will be given a second review at the end of the process. So after the October 15th deadline, just to make absolutely sure that we have gotten out every bit of funding that we possibly can. We want to make sure that anybody who starts an application has the opportunity to finish that application ahead of the deadline. So the very last day that you'll be able to start an application by filling out an LOI will be October 8th. So if there's no date that sticks in your head other than this very one, make sure you know that the last day to start an application is October. Okay. And that is what I have to share with all of you. That was a lot of information coming flying at your head very quickly. Does anybody have questions? Or thank you. Does anybody have questions or comments or thoughts that I can start to talk about?
We have some good questions in the chat that I think might be useful for everybody. And some of them were sent by, some of them were sent to everyone, some were sent by direct message. So Sam Stevens of Trent House asks, we might want to apply for a grant that combines work across 2 categories listed on the program support application guidelines, humanities programming and capacity building. Would this be acceptable, or should we focus on one category of work?
No, definitely. You're welcome to apply for program support grants. You can, and GOS grants, frankly, can combine any number of those things. So if it's a little bit of technology, a little bit of program costs, a little bit of capacity building, great.
I have another question, and this is about the reporting requirements for the CARES grant, but I think it would be a good opportunity to also talk about the reporting requirements for this grant.
Sure.
So what were all the reporting requirements from the 2020 round under the CARES Act? I want to be sure we are compliant, so have completed all the reporting before applying. So I had mentioned that we will be following up with people over the next week. You know, the NEH had sort of shifted the goalpost a little bit throughout the process. So they had kind of said, oh, by the way, we want this information now. So if you've already submitted your final report, we'll ask for some supplemental information in the next week or so, and we'll be following up with everybody who hasn't completed it yet. And you will need to complete that final report before you are eligible, but you can start your application. You'll just have over the next month or so, you'll need to work, or 3 weeks, I should say, if you're planning to apply in the July round.
We're specifically looking, this is for anybody who applied for a COVID-19 grant last year and maybe didn't send in their final report yet. If you haven't, we will be emailing you in the next 2 weeks to let you know for sure that we did not receive your grant. If you did submit your final report already, you're good. We are actually going to we need to gather a little bit more information from everybody who submitted a report, but we're not going to make you wait to fill out that information to apply for your next grant. If you're specifically not sure, check in with us. But I can tell you, you're going to hear from us specifically from my intern, Rachel Barber. if you have not yet, if we have not received your final report for your original COVID-19 response grant from last year.
Another question is, will you be dividing the funding equally between GOS and program support, or is this something you will address once you get grants and understand needs?
Yes. Bye, Leah. Enjoy your meeting. We anticipate that there is probably going to be more need for GOS grants than for program support grants. However, other than saying we know we want to keep grants in all 3 rounds, or keep funding available in all 3 rounds, we have not specifically designated how much will go to program support versus general operating support. So no, we're going to designate funds based on where need is, rather than saying there's definitely going to be this amount for GOS and this amount for program support.
Great, thank you. And one more question I see. Will universities be eligible to ask for indirect costs for program support grants?
No, and it's not just universities, it is everybody. And indirect costs are they're, with a tiny little bit of exception in general operating support grants, indirect costs are not eligible at all in this funding period. This was a little surprising, to be perfectly honest. But I should also mention, both for universities and other, but it's particularly relevant for universities, that things like the staff costs are not considered indirect costs for the purposes of this grant.
Okay, I know we had talked about doing breakout rooms, but I have some questions in here that I might think would be beneficial to everyone. So
let's just go with this.
Okay, great. Under the program support grant, must capacity building activities be focused specifically on capacity to implement programs, or general organization capacity building acceptable? Will that be acceptable? And I think.
Okay.
So it's whether it's
So
this is for program support specifically.
Yeah, for program support specifically, all expenses associated with a program support grant have to be toward that humanities program. So that's sort of the overarching thing. So yes, capacity building activities, programmatic activities, everything is related to that, to your program support grant. Now, I'm saying that with a tiny bit of hesitation, because I bet there's some way that I'm wrong about that. I bet there's some instance where there might be a broader answer than what I just said. So generally speaking, it has to relate to your humanities program. But if you think you might have something else more broadly, we should talk about it.
Yeah, so does anyone else have any questions? So, feel free to raise your hand if you want to get on the microphone and ask a question, or you can put it in chat and I can relay it to Gigi.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a question, Gigi.
Yeah, go ahead.
We were looking at, my organization was working on the strategic planning when this all happened.
Oh boy.
And so now we realized, like, even more that we needed strategic planning.
Yeah.
And the way it was written on the website, we were under the impression that it was strategic planning just as it related to COVID, or is that wrong?
So I would say strategic planning that has needs that have resulted from COVID are particularly, would be particularly compelling. However, I think you'll be hard pressed to find a single organization that did not need to do some level of strategic planning just because of the bananas insane year we've had that turned everything upside down. So I think it would be very hard for us to say, no, your strategic planning does not in any way relate to COVID. Let's put it that way. Does that make sense?
Okay, because we also we're trying to address strategic planning, even going back to Hurricane Superstorm Sandy, because that almost wiped out our organization too. So
Yeah.
we really feel like we need a strategic plan that, makes us a more nimble organization to deal with any of these things.
Yeah, Bunny, that's a really excellent example. Thank you for saying that, because you're reminding me actually of something that came up in our sessions with the National Endowment for the Humanities, that broadly, like I said, this grant making is related to emergency relief, but also this broad idea of recovery. And one of the things that I think we saw this way before a lot of others, some like our colleagues in Louisiana can say this too, that there's broader questions about emergency planning, what is necessary for recovery, that go beyond just this specific instance, but like, how can we become more versatile, nimble, responsive organizations when any type of emergency confronts us? I think that is the NEH was very clear that is an excellent use of funds.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So I have a follow-up question from Sam Stevens at the Trent House, and this is about the last question. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, you can feel free to get on the microphone, but it's a question about whether program support must, whether it must support capacity building activities focused on a specific program. And it says, Sam asked, does it need to relate to a specific humanities program or to humanities programming in general, or to our humanities program in general, because they have multiple humanities programs that they operate?
Yeah, Sam, did you have anything to add?
Just that one of the things that we're finding is that we're doing lots of programming, and it's some of people, like our funders, know about what we're doing, but our general audience that we would normally reach, and including donors and so on, are not yet aware of what we're doing. And we feel like if we could get that information out more effectively, we would be stronger. And so I wasn't sure whether we would need to do capacity building regarding how do we build our capacity to do a specific type of program or specific thing, or could it be to generally support us to be able to do humanities programming by getting the word out about ourselves?
That's a great question, Sam. This is going to be, and you're specifically looking at program support grants, correct?
Yes, we don't qualify for general operating support.
Yeah. This is a great example for organizations, and the answer is going to be, it's going to depend on the organization. So as I said, any program support grants have to relate to humanities programs. Your organization, however, may have more than one humanities program, in which case, go ahead and combine them if it makes sense for your organization to do so. Now, in your specific case, Sam, at the Trent House, you are a humanities missioned organization that doesn't hit the other eligibility criteria. So really, all of the work that you do is humanities focused. So yours is in a way an easy fix, because any of the work that you do at the Trent House is going to be eligible for all of the type of funding that we do, for all of this type of funding. For other organizations that are applying for program support because for a different reason, right? If you're not a humanities missioned organization, you may have to think about this in a slightly different way. But let's say you're a social service institution that happens to have, a history program and a book group, right? A literature program. Those are both humanities-based programs. So you could put together a proposal to us that includes expenses related to both of those programs. They do not have to be project specific. I know I'm getting into some serious weeds here with language, but hey, we're the Humanities Council, words matter. But hopefully this is helpful rather than a hindrance for you. If there are multiple ways that you interact with the humanities and run humanities programs, any of those programs would be individually eligible, or you could sort of package them together.
Can I just add something, Gigi? I think this is an important, these are very distinct from our project action incubation project grants, where we're looking to support a discrete articulated project. Like, while we will be asking information and we are looking to see, is there humanities in there? There's a sort of less, it's not as sort of intensive.
Yeah.
As the kind of the evaluation process in the kind of questions we ask.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. Does anyone else have any questions for us while we're still here? You know, we plan to stick around for at least another 5 minutes or so. So don't be shy. If you have any questions, yeah, definitely feel free to put them in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and address them into the crowd.
Glad it was helpful to you, Amy and Jillian. Nice to see you both. Yes, we answered all your questions. Awesome. Thank you, Karis. That's great. Good. Yeah, I was going to say, if we don't really have anything else specifically to share. So if you don't have any questions and you got to scoot, we will not be offended. But we will stick around for another few minutes in case there are some other questions.
I have one thing I'd like to add.
Oh.
If you have questions for us, feel free to email us. You know, we will. We expect the demand to sort of really pick up in the next couple of weeks. So we might have trouble. You know, we usually, with the action and incubation grants, we do a lot of one-to-one calls. We probably won't have the capacity to do that. So I'd say recommend to read the guidelines, and if you have remaining questions, feel free to email us. I put the email in the chat, grants@njhumanities.org. That's the best way to reach us, because Gigi and I both get those emails. So whoever will just get to it first will usually answer it. So that's usually your best bet to get a quick response, is to email grants@njhumanities.org. You know, if it comes out through conversation over email that like a short phone call would kind of help address something, we can do that. But we probably won't have time to sort of answer really basic questions over the phone. So, you know, if you have, definitely recommend reading the guidelines. And if things are still unclear, feel free to shoot us an email. And then, you know, if we feel that in an individual case, it would help to get on the phone, we'll do that.
Well said. Does anybody else have an example that they want to talk through really quick?
Well, we're brilliant. We answered everyone's questions. So
Obviously, that must have been what happened. I have comprehensively managed to share everything you could possibly need to know in 40 minutes. Awesome. Yes, it's the goal. Well then, I think we will wrap up. You know where to reach us if you need us. Depending on how demand goes, we're considering offering things like open office hours at certain times during the week, where you can just pop on and ask questions or talk through something with us. We'll see how things go. Definitely keep an eye on the website and our social media as well. If you have, to hear of other opportunities, you have now fulfilled your need. We have more of these information sessions coming up, but you don't need to, you're welcome back, but you don't need to come back. And like I said, we do have a lot of funding coming in. So, tell all your friends and colleagues and neighbors to please consider applying for these grants. So I'm gonna personally blame all of you if we have to give any of this money back to the federal government along the way. Let's hope they don't actually watch this grant workshop and hear me saying that repeatedly and say, yeah, that's Gigi Neglect, she's got to go.
Well, thank you all for joining us today.
Awesome. We really appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody. And we'll see you soon.